The day Eliza Calloway watched a man she had grown to trust press a ring into another woman's hand, she finally understood that the world did not intend to make a place for someone like her, and that understanding settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, quiet and absolute and sinking all the way down. It was the spring of 1874 in Dustcreek, Texas, a sun-scorched little town that clung to the edge of the Edwards Plateau, the way a drowning man clings to anything solid. The buildings were mostly unpainted timber. The streets were packed red dirt that swirled into rust-colored clouds whenever the wind came howling down from the northwest. And the people who lived there were the particular breed of stubborn that only the frontier seemed to produce. They were not unkind, most of them. They were simply afraid of things they did not understand. And Eliza Calloway, who had been deaf since a fever took her hearing at the age of 4, was something most of them did not understand at all. She was 22 years old, with dark chestnut hair that she wore in a long braid down her back, and dark brown eyes that watched everything with a sharpness that people sometimes found unsettling. She was not unsettling. She was simply paying close attention, because close attention was the only language she had ever fully trusted. She could read lips with an accuracy that surprised people who did not expect it from her, and she had a voice, not the voice most hearing people expected, rougher at the edges, shaped without the feedback of sound, but a voice nonetheless, though she used it sparingly, because the way people's faces changed when they heard it, the slight wince, the careful blankness they arranged over their features like a curtain drawn over something uncomfortable, had taught her long ago that silence was often easier. She lived with her older sister Ruth, who ran the small seamstress shop on the main street of Dustcreek. Ruth was 26 and cheerful and constantly introducing Eliza to eligible men with the manic optimism of someone who genuinely believed that the right presentation was all that stood between her sister and happiness. It had never worked. The men were polite at first, sometimes genuinely curious, but the politeness would always curdle the moment they truly understood what being with a deaf woman meant. They would have to face her when they spoke. They would have to slow down. They would have to learn something new and different, and most men on the frontier in 1874 had enough new and different to contend with already. Thomas Bridger had been the latest in Ruth's long campaign, and he had lasted longer than most. He was a cattle rancher, steady and honest, with a decent plot of land 20 miles outside town. For 6 months, he had come to call on Eliza with a patience that felt almost like the real thing. He had made the effort to face her when he spoke. He had even learned to write things down when lip-reading proved difficult. For 6 months, Eliza had allowed herself to feel something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it, something warm and tentative that she had tended the way you tend a small fire in a very large wind. Then, she had walked past the Dustcreek General Store on a Tuesday afternoon and seen Thomas through the glass, pressing a ring into the hand of Clara Holt, the schoolteacher's daughter, who heard every word that was ever said to her and had never in her life had to ask anyone to repeat themselves. Eliza had stood there on the boardwalk for a long moment, looking at the two of them through the glass, and then she had turned and walked home in the particular composed manner of someone who had been hurt so many times that the hurt had worn grooves in them, familiar channels for the pain to run through so it did not overflow. Ruth had known the moment Eliza walked through the door. Ruth always knew. She had opened her arms and Eliza had allowed herself 10 minutes of being held, and then she had straightened up and picked up the shirt she had been mending for a customer and finished the seam with the careful small stitches that Ruth said were better than hers. And she did not cry, because crying felt like giving something to a world that had not yet earned it. 3 days later, the stranger rode into Dustcreek. He came from the north, which people later said they ought to have guessed, because the north was where things came from that didn't quite fit into the existing order of things. His horse was a big roan quarter horse, broad-chested and travel-worn, and the man on its back was something that made people on the main street stop what they were doing and look. He was well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that spoke not of vanity, but of a life that had required his body to be a working tool, shoulders that seemed to fill the width of a doorframe, forearms that showed the rope-like definition of someone who had spent years doing heavy physical labor, a chest that pressed against his worn flannel shirt as if the shirt had been designed for a smaller man and simply made its peace with the situation. He wore his dark hair longer than most frontier men, brushing the collar of his shirt, a little windblown and unkempt in a way that suggested he had not recently been anywhere with a mirror he cared about. His jaw was covered in several days of dark stubble, and his eyes, when he turned them on the street of Dustcreek for the first time, were a steady, calm gray that missed nothing. His name was Cole Danforth. He was 28 years old, and he had come from a ranch near Abilene, where he had spent 3 years as a foreman after a decade of working cattle drives up and down the Chisholm Trail. He had come to Dustcreek because a man named Henry Pratt had written him a letter offering him the position of ranch manager on the Pratt Spread, which was the largest single piece of cattle land in the county, and because Cole Danforth was the kind of man who, when he had learned everything there was to learn in a place, moved on to where there was more to learn. He was not restless in the way of men who could not be still. He was simply purposeful, and purpose, for Cole, always pointed forward. He rode to the livery stable first, which said something about his character. He saw to his horse before he saw to himself, and then he walked to the Dustcreek Inn, which was run by a stout, cheerful woman named Mabel Hicks, who asked him his name, his business, and whether he took his supper with or without gravy in approximately the same breath. He told her all three, and she showed him to a room upstairs that was small and clean and had a window that looked out over the main street. He came down to supper that evening and ate at a table near the window, because he liked to see what was happening outside. What was happening outside on this particular evening was a commotion in front of the seamstress shop across the street. A man was standing on the boardwalk outside it, red-faced and loud, and even through the glass, Cole could see that whatever he was saying it in the particular explosive way of someone who has decided that volume is a substitute for reason. A young woman had appeared in the doorway of the seamstress shop. She stood her ground with a composure that Cole recognized immediately as the kind that is built from years of practice rather than from ease. She was watching the man's face with absolute focused attention, and her own face was carefully neutral, and there was something in the straight line of her back and the set of her jaw that made Cole set down his fork. He learned later what had happened. The man was a farmer named Wick Caldwell, who had brought a shirt to the seamstress shop for alterations and claimed that the shirt had been returned to him in worse condition than it had been given. He had come to complain to Ruth, but Ruth was out on a delivery, and Eliza was minding the shop, and Wick Caldwell had quickly realized that shouting at Eliza Calloway was a particular kind of frustration because she would not flinch, she would not apologize out of social obligation, she would not be rattled by noise, and this seemed to enrage him more than anything else. He had started saying things that were not about the shirt at all. Cole was out the door of the inn before he had fully decided to be. He crossed the street in 4 long strides, stepped up onto the boardwalk, and put himself between Wick Caldwell and the door of the seamstress shop in a way that was not aggressive, but was absolutely clear. He was taller than Caldwell by 4 inches and wider by considerably more, and his gray eyes were very calm and very direct, and Wick Caldwell looked at him for a moment and did the arithmetic. "Sir," Cole said quietly, "I think this conversation has run its course." Wick Caldwell said several things, none of them worth recording, and then he left. Cole watched him go until he turned the corner, and then he turned back to the woman in the doorway. She was watching him with those sharp, dark eyes, and he saw her lips move in a way that was measured and careful, and he realized she was saying something, but that the something was slightly different in rhythm from what he expected, and he looked at her more carefully, and the understanding came to him not as a shock, but as a quiet rearrangement of what he was seeing. She said, or rather formed with careful deliberateness, "I did not need that." And then, because she had been standing there watching his face the way she always watched faces when she needed to know what they were truly doing, she saw that he had not winced, had not arranged his expression into that particular blend of discomfort and careful blankness that she knew so well. He had simply looked at her steadily, with the same calm gray regard he had turned on Wick Caldwell, as if she were a person of the same consequence. "No," he said, making sure he was facing her fully. "You probably did not, but he needed to be told, and it seemed like someone ought to do it." She looked at him for another moment, assessing. Then she stepped back from the doorway slightly, which was not an invitation but was not a dismissal either, and Cole Danforth, who understood the gradations of a boundary, stayed where he was. "The shirt was fine," she said. "He is the one who tore it." "I believe you," Cole said. She looked at him as if that were an unusual thing to say, which, he supposed, given how men had likely spoken to her over the years, it might well have been. He touched the brim of his hat. "Cole Danforth," he said. "I just arrived in Dustcreek. I'll be managing the Pratt Ranch." She looked at him a moment longer, and something in her face shifted, not warmth exactly, but the possibility of it. "Eliza Calloway," she said. "My sister owns this shop." Cole nodded. He said it was a pleasure to meet her, and meant it, and then he went back across the street because he had left his supper on the table, and he was still genuinely hungry. But he sat by the window the rest of the meal, and he did not think about the Pratt Ranch nearly as much as he thought about the woman in the doorway with the straight back and the steady dark eyes and the composed face that he somehow already knew was not the whole of what she was. He rode out to the Pratt spread the next morning. Henry Pratt was 60 and had the kind of weathered authority that came from building something real on hard ground. He shook Cole's hand with the grip of a man who had never stopped working with his hands, showed him the land, the herd, the hands, and the books, and by noon, Cole had a thorough understanding of what was needed. The ranch was in solid shape, but had grown faster than its management, and what it needed was the kind of organized discipline that Cole had spent a decade learning to provide. He felt the familiar satisfaction of a problem that had a solution, and a solution he knew how to find. But he thought about Eliza Calloway on the ride back to town. He thought about the way she had watched his face. He thought about how she had held herself against the noise of Wick Caldwell's anger, not unaffected. He could see she was not unaffected, but refusing to let the effect show. He thought about the particular quality of her voice, which was not what most people expected, rougher-edged and shaped differently, but which had a kind of directness to it that he found, to his own honest surprise, more compelling than any carefully musical voice he had ever heard. She said what she meant, and she meant what she said, and she left out everything in between. And Cole, who had spent a great deal of his life among men who talked around everything instead of at it, found that more refreshing than he would have predicted. He stopped at the seamstress shop the following Saturday on the pretext of needing a button replaced on his good coat. Ruth Calloway, who was present this time and who had the bright-eyed manner of someone who categorized everything by its romantic potential, sewed on the button in 10 minutes and charged him a nickel and watched him watch Eliza with an expression on her face that she tried to keep neutral and mostly failed. Eliza was at the work table in the back, piecing together what appeared to be a riding skirt. She did not look up immediately, which Cole understood meant not that she was ignoring him, but that she had not yet seen him, because she navigated the world through sight and she could not see around corners. When she did look up and see him, something moved across her face very quickly, not quite surprise, but something related to it, and then she returned to the calm attentiveness he had seen before. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Ruth, sewing on the button with the speed of a woman trying to finish before the interesting part started, looked between them with barely concealed delight. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the third Saturday, the pretext of needing sewing done was wearing thin, and Cole was honest enough with himself to know it. He waited until Ruth had slipped into the back room, which he suspected she had done deliberately, and he turned to Eliza, who was standing at the counter sorting a box of thread spools by color with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. "I do not have anything that needs mending this week," he said, making sure his face was fully toward her. She looked up. "I noticed," she said. He put his hands on the counter. "I would like to ask if you would take a walk with me this evening, around the creek path, if the weather holds." He paused. "I'm asking you directly because I think you prefer directness." Something shifted in those dark eyes. It was careful and measured, but it was there, and it was the thing he had been trying to earn for 3 Saturdays. "I do," she said. "Yes. I will walk with you." The creek path ran along the south edge of town, where a shallow limestone-bottomed creek wound through a stand of live oak trees that threw long shadows in the evening light. It was pleasant in a spare, unpretentious way that suited Dustcreek, not dramatic scenery, but honest and quietly beautiful, the kind of landscape that rewarded people who paid attention to it. Cole had thought about how to walk with Eliza before he arrived. He was a man who thought through practical problems before encountering them, which was part of what made him a good ranch manager and a reasonably good person in general. He understood that walking side by side meant she could not read his lips easily, so he positioned himself slightly ahead when they needed to turn to speak, keeping his face available to her. He spoke in shorter sentences than he usually did, clearly, without rushing. He did not shout, because he understood that volume was not the issue, and when she spoke, he watched her face with the same quality of attention she gave everyone else, and he found that he understood her well, and that understanding her well felt like something he wanted to keep doing. She told him she had grown up in Dustcreek. Her parents had come from Tennessee before she was born, and her father had run a small hardware concern until he died of a chest fever 5 years ago, and her mother had followed him the winter after that, and since then it had been Eliza and Ruth managing as best they could. She said this plainly, without asking for sympathy, in the particular way of someone who has accepted the facts of their life and built around them rather than against them. He told her about the cattle drives. He told her about the Chisholm Trail, about the boredom and the sudden violence of storms, about the particular camaraderie of men who have nothing in common except the same hard work and who discover that is, in fact, enough. He told her about Abilene, which was rougher than Dustcreek in every way. He told her he preferred it here, though he was still deciding exactly why. She asked him, with the directness he had already come to expect, whether he found it inconvenient, talking to her. He understood immediately what she meant. No, he said, and he meant it absolutely. It makes me pay attention. I like paying attention. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not entirely read. Then she looked at the creek, where the last light was catching the shallow current and turning it copper, and she said quietly, "Most people do not like having to pay attention. Most people find it easier to look somewhere else." "Most people," Cole said, "are missing a great deal." She did not say anything to that, but she did not look away from him either, and the evening light was warm on her face, and Cole Danforth, who had never in his life been the kind of man who was susceptible to moments, found himself very thoroughly susceptible to this one. He walked her back to the seamstress shop when it began to get dark. At the door, he asked if she would walk with him again, and she said yes with the same considered directness, and he touched the brim of his hat and went back to the inn, feeling like a man who has discovered, unexpectedly, a path worth following. He rode out to the Pratt Ranch every morning and worked until the light began to fail, and he was good at the work in the way that mattered most, not just technically competent, but genuinely invested, the kind of manager the cattle hands respected, because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself, and never did anything he would not ask of them in return. Henry Pratt watched him with approval and said very little, which Cole had learned to recognize as the highest praise available from a man like Pratt. But in the evenings, when he could, he came back to Dustcreek and found Eliza. They developed a rhythm over the following weeks, the kind of rhythm that builds between two people who are paying very close attention to each other and finding, in the paying of attention, more to be interested in than they expected. They walked the creek path. They sat on the bench outside the general store in the early evening and watched the town do its last business of the day. They sat in the small garden behind the seamstress shop, where Ruth grew tomatoes and herbs, and Ruth brought them lemonade with the transparent delight of someone watching something they wanted to happen unfolding exactly as they hoped. Cole learned things about Eliza that surprised him in the most pleasing possible ways. She was funny, genuinely, sharply funny, in the dry, understated way that required the listener to be paying close enough attention to catch it, which most people were not. But Cole was. She was deeply competent with her hands, not just at sewing, but at everything practical. She had fixed a stuck window at the shop herself, repointed some crumbling mortar on the chimney, rebuilt a broken chair with such neat joinery that Ruth said it was better than before. She had opinions about everything, held them firmly, and changed them when presented with better evidence, which Cole found to be among the most attractive qualities a person could have. And she read, voraciously, constantly, ordering books from the catalog that came from San Antonio, filling the small room she shared with Ruth with stacked volumes on subjects that ranged from natural history to political philosophy to the collected poetry of Walt Whitman. She learned things about Cole that she had not expected either. He was, beneath the frontier competence and the formidable physical presence, a careful and thoughtful man. He had opinions about fairness that were not common among men of his time and place, a bone-deep sense that the measure of a person was their character and their actions, full stop, and that other measures were inventions of convenience. He was gentle with animals and patient with people who were learning, and he had a sense of humor that ran quiet and dry, surfacing unexpectedly in the middle of serious conversations in a way that always made her want to laugh. He had been reading too, it turned out. He had a battered copy of Plutarch's Lives in his saddlebag that he had carried for 3 years and was working through at the pace of a man who reads carefully rather than quickly. In the evenings, when the light was soft, she sometimes caught him watching her face with that calm, gray attention, and the feeling it produced in her was something she did not have easy words for. Not just warmth, but something more specific than warmth, something that felt like being truly seen by someone who was looking for the real thing and had found it, and was not frightened by it. She had been frightened of that feeling ever since Thomas Bridger. She was honest enough with herself to know it, and honest enough with herself to know that the fear was reasonable, and that Cole Danforth had not yet done anything to deserve it being turned on him. But the stone in her chest from the day at the general store window had not entirely dissolved, and on the evenings when it was heaviest, she was quieter than usual. And Cole noticed and did not press, only made himself available in the calm, solid way he made himself available for most things, and that, oddly, was what helped most, was what Ruth noticed all of it. Ruth, being Ruth, said things about it. "He looks at you like you are the only thing worth looking at in the whole county," she said one morning, sitting across from Eliza at the breakfast table with a cup of coffee and the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a particular thing to happen and is finally seeing it happen. Eliza, who was braiding her hair, said nothing. "I have watched men look at women," Ruth continued, "for 26 years, and I know what looking out of politeness looks like, and I know what looking out of obligation looks like, and I know what looking because they think they are supposed to look looks like, and I know what the other kind looks like. The real kind. Eliza, he is looking at you with the real kind." Eliza finished her braid. She picked up her own coffee. She looked at her sister with the careful, composed face, and then, because it was Ruth and Ruth had been right about most things over the years, she let the composure slip just slightly. "I know," she said. "And?" Ruth said. "And I'm afraid," Eliza said. "Is that not obvious?" "I'm very afraid." Ruth set down her coffee and reached across the table and took both of Eliza's hands in hers. "He's not Thomas Bridger," she said. "No," Eliza agreed. "He is not. That is part of what frightens me." Ruth looked at her for a long moment, and then she squeezed her hands and let them go, and she said, "Give him a chance to show you who he is." The summer deepened, and the Texas heat settled over Dustcreek like a weight, the kind of heat that turned the sky white at noon and brought the cattle to the creek beds and made everyone move slower, except the people who did not have the option of moving slower. Cole was one of those people. The Pratt Ranch was in the middle of an expansion, adding 200 acres of grazing land that required new fencing, and Cole worked alongside the hands every day, digging post holes in the baked earth, running wire, checking water sources, doing the particular kind of brutal, sustained physical work that turned his skin dark brown and made the muscles in his arms and back more defined than ever, which Ruth noticed and reported to Eliza with the journalistic thoroughness of a woman who considered such observations a public service. Eliza began teaching Cole something she had not expected to teach anyone. It had started simply. He had asked her, one evening by the creek, how she had learned to read lips so well, whether it was something she had been taught or something she had figured out on her own. She had explained that it was both, that her mother had worked with her carefully when she was young, before her parents got sick, and that after that she had simply practiced on everyone she encountered. And then, because she was curious, and because she had begun to notice that Cole asked questions in the spirit of genuine wanting to know rather than the spirit of making conversation, she had asked him whether he knew that she also communicated with her hands sometimes, with her sister and a few others who had learned. He had said he did not know and had asked her to show him. She had shown him a few signs, common ones, simple ones, the kind she used most often with Ruth. He had watched her hands with the same close attention he gave her face, and he had tried to replicate the signs with his large, calloused hands, and the result had been imperfect but earnest, in a way that caught at something in her chest. "That is not quite right," she said, and she reached over and adjusted the position of his fingers, which required her to touch his hand, which she had not done before. And the touch was brief and practical, and she was perfectly composed about it. But she was also aware of it in a way she had not been aware of similar brief practical contacts with other people. He looked at the sign she had corrected, and then he made it again. Better this time. He looked at her. "Like that?" "Better," she said. He nodded, and she could see him filing it away with the same systematic thoroughness he apparently brought to everything else. She showed him a few more that evening, and the next time they met he had practiced them, she could tell, because they were cleaner than they had been. She did not know then what he was really doing. She thought he was simply being attentive, being kind, learning a few signs the way a person might learn a few words of a foreign language in the spirit of courtesy. She did not know that he had gone back to the inn that night and asked Mabel Hicks if she knew of any books that might teach a man the hand language that the deaf used. She did not know that Mabel, who knew everything about everything in Dustcreek as innkeepers always do, had mentioned that the schoolteacher had a book on manual alphabet that had come with a shipment of educational materials from Austin. She did not know that Cole had gone to the schoolteacher, a dry, scholarly man named Arthur Vine, and asked to borrow it, and had sat in his room at the inn every evening that week working through the manual alphabet with his big rancher's hands until he had it solid. She found out about the book by accident 6 weeks later, when she was in the school one afternoon helping Arthur Vine's wife, Margaret, repair the curtains. And Margaret mentioned in passing that Cole Danforth had borrowed a book on deaf sign language 2 months back and had since come back to ask about additional resources, and that Arthur had written to the Texas School for the Deaf in Austin on his behalf to ask about available materials. Eliza held the curtain she was hemming very still for a moment. "Did you say he wrote to the school?" she said. "Arthur wrote on his behalf," Margaret confirmed, threading her own needle. "They sent back a pamphlet and a list of references. Mr. Danforth has been working through them systematically." She looked up. "He's not mentioned this to you?" "No," Eliza said, "he has not." She went home that evening and sat in the garden behind the shop and thought about this for a long time. The tomato plants Ruth had put in were tall and heavy with fruit now, and the evening air smelled of warm earth and greenery, and a mockingbird in the live oak at the garden's edge was going through its entire repertoire with apparent satisfaction. Eliza sat very still and thought about a man who had, without being asked, without telling her, without making a point of it or using it as a proof of his goodness, simply decided to learn her language. She thought about what that meant, not the gesture of it, the substance of it. He had looked at her world and decided it was worth entering on its own terms. He had not asked her to translate herself into something easier for him to understand. He had instead, quietly and systematically, gone about understanding her. Ruth came out with 2 cups of tea and sat beside her and followed her gaze toward the mockingbird. "You're thinking very hard about something," Ruth observed. "He is learning sign language," Eliza said. "He has been for 2 months. He never told me." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why do you think he did not tell you?" "I do not know," Eliza said. "Unless," she stopped. "Unless he is still learning," Ruth said. "Unless he wants to be good at it before he offers it to you." Eliza looked at the mockingbird, which had started a new sequence, something that might have been a mockery of a meadowlark. She thought about Cole Danforth sitting in his small room at the inn with a pamphlet from the Texas School for the Deaf, practicing signs with his big hands that had spent a decade working cattle, choosing to do this because he had decided she was worth the doing. The stone in her chest shifted, not dissolved, not yet, but shifted, changed position, became something slightly different from what it had been. She did not say anything to him about it. She decided to wait and let it come when it came. But something had changed in the way she saw him. Something had opened slightly in the composed face she showed to the world, and she saw him see it, and she saw him understand, though not fully, that something had changed, and she saw the careful, quiet pleasure that moved across his face in response, quickly, the way a cloud shadow moves across open ground. September came. The heat began to ease at the edges. The cattle drives that had been the summer's main business wound down, and Dustcreek settled into the slightly more thoughtful pace of early fall, when people were still warm enough to be outside in the evenings, but the brutal urgency of the summer had receded. The live oak leaves on the creek path were dry and gold at their edges, and the creek itself was lower, its limestone bed showing more in the afternoon, pale and smooth in the slant light. Cole had been working with the Pratt Ranch to prepare for the fall cattle sale, which brought buyers from as far as San Antonio and once, memorably, from Kansas City. Henry Pratt was in excellent spirits, which meant he was slightly less laconic than usual, and he had taken to stopping Cole at the end of the day to talk about cattle prices and land management and the future of the Edwards Plateau, in a way that felt to Cole like the conversations a father might have with a son he was beginning to trust with the large ideas. Cole went into town more often than strictly necessary. Henry Pratt noticed but did not mention it, because Henry Pratt had met Eliza Calloway once when she had come out to the ranch with Ruth to deliver a repaired saddle blanket, and he had watched Cole watch her with the same expression that Ruth had catalogued, and he had reached the same conclusion. On a warm Saturday in late September, Cole arrived at the seamstress shop at the usual time and found Eliza sitting on the front step with her knees drawn up, reading, the sun on the dark braid down her back. She looked up when his shadow fell across the page, and, for the first time he could remember, she smiled at him before she had arranged her face into anything considered. It was just a smile, unguarded and real, and it was the most valuable thing he had seen in a very long time. He sat down on the step beside her. She showed him what she was reading, a book of poems by a man named Sidney Lanier, who she explained was a Southerner who had written about the natural world with the kind of attention that made the natural world feel like it had something to say. Cole read the passage she pointed out, a long, slow poem about the Georgia marshes, the way the light came through the tall grass, the quality of silence over water. He read it twice and then looked up. "He is paying attention," Cole said. "Yes," Eliza said. "That is why I like him." Their eyes met, and the meaning in that was not about the poem, and they both knew it, and Eliza's composed face did something complicated and warm, and then settled into the closest thing to openly happy that Cole had yet seen there. He asked her that afternoon if she would come to the fall social with him. Dustcreek held a community gathering every fall at the grain barn, cleared out and strung with lanterns, with a fiddle player and a caller and long tables of food that the women of the town contributed to with the competitive enthusiasm that was, in the absence of other outlets, one of the primary creative expressions available to them. He asked her with his face clear and his words careful, because he wanted her to hear him well, and he asked her with the slight self-consciousness of a man who was not used to asking for things and was doing it anyway because what he wanted was worth the asking. She said yes. Ruth made Eliza a dress for the social because Ruth was a seamstress, and also because the project gave her something to do with the energy of her delight, which was otherwise in danger of becoming uncontainable. It was a blue-gray dress that matched the color of the evening sky over the plateau, and sat on Eliza's shoulders in a way that was simple and decided, as Eliza herself was simple and decided. Eliza looked at herself in the small mirror in their room and felt something that was not vanity, but was not nothing either. A quiet acknowledgement that she wanted to look well, that she wanted him to see her at her best, and that this wanting, which she had given up on for a while, was back and was welcome. Cole came to collect her in clean clothes, with his dark hair combed back and his hat in his hand, and when he saw her, he went briefly and completely still in the way of a man confronted with something he had not fully expected. He recovered in a second, but she had seen it, and the seeing of it was warm. "You look beautiful," he said, making sure she could see his face and meaning every word. They walked to the barn together, and the town noticed them, as small towns always notice these things, and there was a hum of comment and opinion that Eliza could not hear and did not need to, because she was watching Cole, and Cole was watching her, and the rest of Dustcreek could arrange its opinions in whatever order it liked. The fiddle player was a man named Obadiah Crane, who had been playing at Dustcreek socials for 20 years and who played with the joyful physical investment of someone who genuinely loved the job. The caller was Obadiah's wife, who had a voice that carried to the back of any building she stood in. The food was exceptional, as it always was, and the lanterns threw warm gold light over everything, and the children ran between the adult legs with the frantic energy of people who had been given a later bedtime and intended to make full use of it. Cole did not ask Eliza to dance, which she appreciated, because dancing required hearing the beat, which presented obvious difficulties, and because he had clearly thought about this before arriving rather than discovering it in the moment and becoming awkward. Instead, they sat at one of the long tables and ate and talked, and several people came to speak with them, and Cole made a point every time of positioning himself so that Eliza could see everyone who was addressing them, angling the conversation toward her without making a production of it. And Eliza, watching him do this, felt something in her chest that had no words she knew, but was very large and very warm and very certain. At one point, a woman Cole had not met before, the wife of one of the Pratt ranch hands, leaned close to Eliza and said something that Eliza could not entirely read in the noise and movement of the room. And before Eliza could ask her to repeat it, Cole had leaned forward slightly and said, calm and pleasant, "Eliza reads lips, so if you could face her directly, she catches most of it that way." He said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, without apology or excessive explanation, as if it were simply a practical piece of information, like a table being slightly uneven or a road being faster the other way. The woman nodded and faced Eliza directly and repeated herself, and Eliza understood her, and the conversation continued, and Cole went back to his supper as if he had done nothing remarkable. Eliza looked at him from the side, and he was eating his supper with the straightforward appetite of a man who had been working physically all day, and he glanced up and caught her looking and raised an eyebrow slightly. She shook her head, which in this case meant nothing, or rather meant too much to explain in the middle of a crowded grain barn, and he seemed to understand this because he nodded slightly and went back to his supper, and under the table, his hand, large and warm and calloused from 3 years of fence posts and cattle work, found hers and held it, and she let him. The October sky over the Edwards Plateau was the particular deep blue that only comes in the dry, clear air of a Texas fall, and the mornings were cool now with the first real suggestion of winter underneath them, and the evenings smelled of cedar smoke from the stoves people were starting to use again. Cole had been writing in the evenings. He had not told anyone what he was writing. He had a small notebook from the general store, and he filled pages of it in a careful, methodical hand. And when Mabel Hicks asked him once what he was working on, he said, "Study notes," which was not entirely untrue. He had received, 6 weeks ago, a package from the Texas School for the Deaf in Austin. It had been forwarded by Arthur Vine, who had gotten it from his contact there, and it contained a detailed illustrated guide to the sign language in use at the school, which was derived from the French method that had been brought to America by Laurent Clerc and Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet at the American School for the Deaf 50 years earlier. It was more comprehensive than anything Cole had worked from before, and he had been working through it with the same systematic determination he applied to everything that mattered to him. He was not learning it as a performance. He was not learning it to impress her. He was learning it because he had looked at the world she lived in, the world of silence and close attention and the constant effort of translation, and he had decided that the right thing to do was to come to her in it, to learn enough of her language that the space between them was not always being crossed on her terms alone, but on both of theirs. He thought about fairness with the bone-deep seriousness he had always brought to it, and this was a matter of fairness as he understood it, and so he worked. He was not yet fluent. He knew he was not yet fluent, but he was getting there. In the meantime, he and Eliza had settled into something that was not yet named, but was real in the way of things that have built themselves up gradually from genuine material. They met 3 or 4 evenings a week. They had moved beyond the careful politeness of early acquaintance into the more comfortable territory of people who have learned each other's rhythms and have decided those rhythms suit them. He knew that she needed a moment to settle into a new environment before she could fully relax in it, because she was always reading the room, always calculating the information she could gather. She knew that he went quiet when he was thinking hard, and that the quiet was not distance but concentration, and that after the quiet, he would say something worth having heard. One evening in late October, sitting in the garden behind the seamstress shop with the last of Ruth's tomato plants, dry and spent beside them, and the live oak putting its shadow long across the packed earth, Eliza told him about Thomas Bridger. She had not planned to. She had been thinking about something else entirely, and then she had looked at Cole's profile in the late light, the strong jaw and the slightly too long hair, and the calm, unhurried quality of him sitting beside her, and the thinking about something else entirely had become impossible. She told him plainly and without drama, the way she told things, beginning to end, what had happened. 6 months. The ring in the general store, the careful arrangements of faces that told her more than the words. She did not ask him to feel anything about it, only told it as a fact. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to face her fully, which he always did when he was saying something he wanted her to understand completely. "He was a fool," Cole said, "and not for the reason you might think. Not because of what he gave up, though that would be sufficient. Because a man who spends 6 months learning someone and then decides they are not worth the rest of the effort, that man has told you something important about himself. He was looking for easy. Easy does not last, Eliza. It is not interesting enough to last." She looked at him. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Are you telling me that you find me interesting enough to last?" He looked back at her, and the gray eyes were steady and warm, and he said, "Yes, that is exactly what I'm telling you." The stone that had been in her chest since the day at the general store window finally, completely, dissolved. She did not throw herself at him, that was not who she was, but she reached over and put her hand on top of his where it rested on his knee, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And they sat in the fading October light, and the mockingbird in the live oak sang its mimicry of everything it had ever heard, and Eliza Calloway, for the first time in a long while, felt entirely at home in her own life. November brought the first cold fronts, the blue northers that swept down from the panhandle with no warning and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in an hour and sent everyone scrambling for coats and stovewood. Cole spent those days at the ranch, making sure the cattle were moved to sheltered pasture, that the water troughs wouldn't freeze hard, that the hands had what they needed to work in the cold. He was in his element in that kind of urgency, the physical problem and the clear necessity and the satisfaction of moving through it competently. And Henry Pratt, watching him manage the first norther of the season, told his wife that evening that hiring Cole Danforth was the best decision he had made in a decade. Eliza, in the evenings, taught him more. It had become something they did deliberately now, and it was different from his private study in the way that practice with a real speaker is different from practice with a book. She showed him the signs she and Ruth used, which had developed partly from the formal system and partly from the particular shortcuts that people who live closely together develop, and he learned them with the same careful attention, asking her to repeat things and explain the logic behind them and correct him when his hands did the wrong thing. His hands, those large, calloused working hands, were more dexterous than she had expected, and he had a good spatial memory, which helped. She did not yet know how deeply he had gone into it on his own. She knew he had borrowed the book from Arthur Vine. She did not know about the package from Austin, did not know about the notebook, did not know about the systematic hours he had put in. She saw only what he showed her in these evenings, which was more than enough to move her. A man learning sincerely, a man applying himself to the task of understanding her world, and not because she had asked him to, not because he expected anything in return, but because he thought it was the right thing, and because she was worth it. One evening in mid-November, they were sitting by the stove in the back room of the seamstress shop, which was warm and smelled of the beeswax Ruth used to condition the leather goods she occasionally worked. Eliza was teaching him the sign for, "I understand," and he made it, and she nodded, and then he looked at her hands for a moment, and then made a sequence of signs that she had not taught him. She stared at his hands. Then she looked at his face. He had said, in sign, with clumsy but clear grammar and the particular earnest effort of someone speaking in a language they have been learning in private, "You are the most honest person I have ever met." She stared at him for a long moment, and for once her composed face did absolutely nothing to contain what was happening underneath it. She could feel it, could feel the expression on her face, and she did not try to manage it. She just looked at him, and whatever her face was showing him, it was real. "You have been studying," she said. "For several months," he said. He looked slightly self-conscious, which on Cole was extraordinary, like watching a mountain look uncertain. "I'm not good yet, but I'm getting better." "Why?" she said. "Why did you not tell me?" He thought about it for a moment. "Because I did not want it to be a gift I was presenting. I wanted it to just be something I could do, something I could offer you, a real conversation, not a performance of learning." He paused. "I wanted to be able to talk to you in your language because it is your language, not because I wanted you to see me doing something kind." Eliza looked at him for a very long time. Outside, a norther was pushing against the windows, the dry winter wind rattling the glass, and the stove was ticking with heat, and the beeswax smell was warm around them, and Cole Danforth sat across from her with his large hands quiet in his lap, and his gray eyes very open and steady, waiting for her to say whatever she was going to say. She did not say anything for a while. She was thinking about all the times she had translated herself for the world, about the years of managing the discomfort of others, of shrinking her own needs to fit inside the dimensions of what other people found convenient, about Thomas Bridger, who had learned to face her when he spoke because it was the minimum requirement and had decided even that was too much, about every man and every person who had looked at her and seen, first and always, the complication. And she thought about this man who had ridden into Dustcreek on a roan horse and seen Wick Caldwell shouting at her and had stepped into it without being asked, and who had spent months learning her language in private because he wanted to give her a real conversation rather than a performance, and who held her hand in a crowded barn and told anyone who needed to know to face her directly with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who had thought about it and arrived at his position and was not particularly interested in discussing alternatives. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. She reached up and touched his face very briefly, her fingers against the dark stubble of his jaw, and said, "No one has ever done that for me before." His hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his face, and he held it there for a moment, warm and solid. "Then everyone before me was not paying enough attention," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the kind of careful steadiness that was entirely him, and outside the norther pushed cold air across the plateau, and inside the stove held its warmth. December came in slowly, the way December does in South Texas, with cold mornings and mild afternoons, and nights that made the stars very clear and very close. The live oaks along the creek kept most of their leaves, going only slightly bronze at the edges, because live oaks are that kind of stubborn. Christmas preparations were beginning in Dustcreek, greenery on the storefronts, the sound of children being rehearsed for the church pageant drifting from the schoolhouse on still afternoons. Cole and Eliza were, by this point, something that Dustcreek had accepted and absorbed into its social fabric, with the pragmatic efficiency small towns apply to things that are clearly going to be part of the landscape, regardless of opinion. There had been talk, because there was always talk, and some of it had been unkind in the way that talk about Eliza often was. The particular brand of small-town cruelty that dressed itself as concern, people saying it was a shame, what a capable man would have to deal with, how difficult it must be, and similar remarks that were about their own discomfort with Eliza's difference rather than anything real about her. Cole had been present for 2 instances of this and had responded both times in the calm, absolutely unbending way he responded to things he had found to be wrong, which was to disagree clearly and completely without raising his voice, and then to be done with it. The people who had made the remarks had found the experience somewhat like arguing with a barn wall and had concluded sensibly that it was not worth pursuing. Ruth, for her part, was in a state of happiness that expressed itself primarily as productivity. She had made 3 new dresses, reorganized the entire shop, taken on 2 new customers, and begun knitting with a focus that suggested she was working toward a particular goal without wanting to say what it was. Eliza watched her sister with the fond exasperation of a person who loves someone very well and finds their enthusiasm occasionally exhausting. "You are getting ahead of yourself," Eliza told her one morning. "I am not getting ahead of anything," Ruth said, not looking up from her knitting. "I'm simply keeping busy." "You're knitting what appears to be a blanket for a double bed," Eliza said. "We have single beds." Ruth's needles did not slow. "It is never too early to prepare." Cole, that same week, had a conversation with Henry Pratt that was not about cattle. He had gone to Pratt's office at the ranch house at the end of the workday, as he sometimes did to go over the books, and Pratt had poured 2 glasses of whiskey, which he only did when the conversation was going to be of a personal rather than professional nature. Cole accepted the glass and waited. "You have been seeing Eliza Calloway for some months," Pratt said. He said it as a fact, not a question. "Yes," Cole said. "She is a fine woman," Pratt said. "Her father was a good man. I knew him a little. He would have been particular about who was around his daughters." He looked at Cole steadily. "Are your intentions settled?" Cole looked back at him with equal steadiness. "They are," he said. "I intend to ask her. When I have something proper to offer, and when I am ready to ask her in the way she deserves to be asked." Pratt nodded slowly. He turned his glass. "I have been thinking about the future of this ranch," he said. "I have no sons. My daughters are in San Antonio and have no interest in cattle. I'm not a young man, Danforth." He looked at Cole directly. "I would want the man who runs this ranch to have a stake in it, a real stake." Cole understood what was being offered and took a moment to sit with the weight of it before responding. It was the kind of offer that changed a man's life, and Henry Pratt was not a man who made such offers lightly. "I am listening," Cole said. What came out of the conversation was a formal arrangement. Cole would take a partial ownership stake in the Pratt Ranch, building toward full management and eventual inheritance of the operation in exchange for his commitment to the land and the work and the continuity of what Pratt had built. It was not a small thing. It meant Cole Danforth, who had come to Dustcreek with his saddlebag and his roan horse and his copy of Plutarch, would have land, a real home. He rode back to Dustcreek in the cold December dark, with the plains spread out around him silver in the starlight, and he thought about what he was going to say to Eliza, and about how he was going to say it, and about the particular manner in which he wanted to ask her the question he had been moving toward since the evening in October when she had put her hand on his and he had understood completely that this was the woman he wanted to build his life with. He went to see Arthur Vine the following morning. Arthur Vine was grading papers when Cole knocked on the schoolhouse door, and he looked up with the mildly surprised expression of a man who had expected no visitors and was making the best of having one. He knew Cole from the book Borrowing and the correspondence with Austin, and he respected him in the dry, precise way of a scholarly man who respects practical competence, which is rarer than it looks. "I need your help," Cole said. "I need to be able to say something specific in sign, and I need to say it correctly." Arthur Vine looked at him over his spectacles for a long moment, and something moved in his precise, dry face that might have been approval. "Sit down," he said. What Cole needed to say required the better part of 2 hours to practice to his satisfaction, and Arthur Vine, who turned out to have more than a passing knowledge of the formal sign language himself from his time at a school in the Northeast, was a careful and exact teacher. Cole worked at it with the same grim, focused patience he brought to fence posts and ledger books, and by the time he left the schoolhouse, the winter afternoon had gone blue and cold, and he was as ready as he was going to be. He had one more thing to see to. There was a jeweler in Dustcreek, not a real jeweler, not the kind you'd find in San Antonio, but a watchmaker named Lemuel Cross, who occasionally worked with gold and silver, and who had, according to Mabel Hicks, a small selection of rings that he made in the slow season. Cole went to Lemuel Cross's shop, which smelled of oil and metal and the particular dusty precision of a man who spent his days working with very small things. He looked at what Cross had, and he found one that suited Eliza, or rather that suited his understanding of Eliza, not ornate, not showy, a narrow gold band set with a small dark garnet, simple and well-made, and exactly the kind of thing that belonged on the hand of a woman who valued substance over performance. He rode back to Dustcreek on a clear, cold Saturday afternoon in late December, the ring in his coat pocket, his heart doing something it did not usually do. Cole Danforth, who had stood calm in the face of storms and difficult cattle and difficult men, who had ridden the Chisholm Trail in the dark and the rain and been entirely untroubled, was nervous. He was nervous because this mattered more than anything else he had ever done, and that was not a familiar sensation, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it. He went to the seamstress shop. Eliza was there, alone. Ruth had gone to the Hicks Inn for a Christmas gathering that Cole suspected Ruth had arranged specifically to provide this window, because Ruth was Ruth and had been maneuvering toward this outcome for months with the thoroughness of a military campaign conducted entirely through casseroles and knitting. Eliza looked up from the work table when he came in, and she saw immediately that something was different. His face was composed, but not in the ordinary way. It was the composure of someone who has made a decision and is walking toward it, and she watched him come toward her with her full attention, which was her fullest possible attention, the kind that missed nothing. He stopped in front of her. He did not say anything with his mouth. Instead, he raised his hands. He spoke to her entirely in sign. It was not perfect, and she knew it was not perfect because she knew sign and she could see the places where his grammar was slightly wrong and where his hand position was approximately, but not exactly correct. But it was real, and it was clear, and it was him. She could see the particular determined focus he brought to everything, the careful construction of meaning, the effort and the sincerity of the effort. He told her in her language, in the language he had been learning in private for months, because he had wanted to offer her a real conversation rather than a performance, that she was the best person he had ever known, that he had come to Dustcreek looking for work and had found something he had not expected to find and did not intend to let go of, that he had a home to offer her now, land and a real future, and that he wanted to build it with her if she would let him. And then he took the ring from his coat pocket and looked at her and said, with his hands and with his voice both, because he wanted her to have both, "Eliza Calloway, will you marry me?" She looked at his hands. She looked at the ring. She looked at his face, which was open in a way she had not seen it be before, all the calm composure present, but underneath it entirely visible, the wanting and the waiting and the particular vulnerability of a man who has handed the most important question of his life to someone else to answer. Her eyes were very bright. She raised her hands and she said, in sign, with the clean, fluent ease of someone speaking their own language, "Yes." And then, because she wanted him to have both as well, she said it out loud. "Yes." And her voice was the voice he had heard for 7 months, rough-edged and direct and entirely hers, and it was the best sound he had ever heard. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it on her hand. And then she looked up at him, and he pulled her close and held her. And she let herself be held in the way she very rarely let herself be held, not carefully, not composedly, but completely, her face against his chest and her hands in the flannel of his shirt, and he had one arm around her back and one hand at the back of her head, and they stood in the seamstress shop in the December afternoon light for a long time without moving at all. Ruth came home 2 hours later and burst into tears of happiness, so total and unconcealed that Cole, who had stayed for supper, was genuinely moved by them. She embraced Eliza for a long time, and then turned to Cole and embraced him as well, with the force of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this and had full feelings about its arrival. Cole, who was not generally a man who was embraced by people he had not known for very long, received this with good grace and patted her back carefully, and Eliza watched from across the table with an expression that was, in the privacy of this moment, the most openly happy he had ever seen her. They were married the following March, 1875, when the plateau was coming back to life after the winter and the creek was running higher from the spring rains and the live oaks were putting out their new dusty green growth. The ceremony was held in the Dustcreek church, which was small and white-painted and smelled of old wood and lamp oil. And the whole town came, because Dustcreek was the kind of place where the whole town came to weddings, and also because the particular story of Cole Danforth and Eliza Calloway had been watched and discussed and debated and finally, largely, celebrated. Because even the people who had initially had their doubts had come to understand that there was nothing to doubt. What they had was plain to see for anyone who looked. Arthur Vine stood up at the ceremony and, at Cole's request, signed the vows alongside the spoken words, so that Eliza had both, the sound and the silence, the spoken language and her own, both present in the same moment. There were people in the church who had never seen sign language before, and they watched Arthur's hands with various degrees of curiosity and confusion and dawning understanding. And Eliza, standing at the front of the church in Ruth's best sewing, a cream wool dress with small pearl buttons that had taken Ruth 3 weeks to complete, stood there watching Cole say his vows with his voice, and then watching Arthur render them in her language, and the combination of the two was almost more than her careful composure could contain. She felt Ruth, standing behind her, reach forward and briefly squeeze her hand, and she squeezed back. Cole said his vows in a clear, steady voice, and then, at the end, when the official words were finished, he raised his hands and added something that was not in the formal ceremony, something Arthur had not been told to translate because it was between the two of them. He signed it to her directly, and it was not perfect, but it was real, and it said, "I will learn more every day." She signed back, quick and private, just for him. So will I. Henry Pratt, who had come to the ceremony with his wife, shook Cole's hand at the end with the grip of a man sealing a real agreement, which it was, and the wife cried, which she had apparently warned Henry she would do, and which did not seem to trouble him. The ranch house on the Pratt spread had a front porch that faced west, where the sunset over the plateau turned the sky red and orange and occasionally purple in combinations that seemed excessive and real in equal measure. Eliza stood on that porch the evening of their first day there as a married couple and looked out at the land, the cedar and live oak rolling away to the edge of the visible world, the cattle moving slow and dark against the pale grass of the late afternoon. And she thought about how she had never expected this. Not this particular life, not this particular porch, not this particular land. She had expected something smaller and more carefully managed, the kind of life that fits itself around limitations and calls that good enough. She had not expected to find herself here, with land under her feet and her name on a marriage certificate, and a man inside the house who had learned her language in private for months before he asked her to spend her life with him. Cole came out and stood beside her and handed her a cup of coffee and looked at the sunset with the same attention he gave everything. "It is ours," he said. "It is ours," she agreed, and the word settled into her chest exactly where the stone had been, warm and solid and permanent. They fell into the life of the ranch with the particular ease of two people who have chosen each other after careful consideration and found the choosing to be entirely correct. Cole ran the cattle operations with the same systematic competence he brought to everything, expanding the herd, improving the water management, hiring 2 additional hands, and working alongside all of them in the physical, laboring way that kept their respect. Eliza ran the house with the practical intelligence she had always applied to everything, making the bare-bones ranch house into something genuinely livable. She planted a kitchen garden, she reorganized the storeroom, she mended things that had been left broken for years, and she brought her books and her sewing and the particular quality of her full attention into every corner of it, and the house responded by becoming a home. Ruth came for supper every Sunday, which became a fixed point of the week that all 3 of them relied on more than they said. Ruth had, in the year since Cole had arrived in Dustcreek, become slightly less focused on Eliza's romantic prospects, which had been resolved, and slightly more focused on her own, which had not, though Cole had noticed that she seemed to find reasons to be in the general store on Saturday mornings when a quiet, dark-eyed man named Peter Walsh, who ran the freight operation out of Dustcreek, was often there. He mentioned this to Eliza once, and she said she had noticed this as well and was allowing events to proceed at their own pace, which was, Cole had come to understand, one of Eliza's core operating principles, and generally a wise one. In October of 1875, Eliza told Cole that she was expecting a child. She told him in sign, which she now did more often for the things that mattered most to her, because Cole's sign was genuinely good now, not perfect still, but fully communicative, and because using her own language for the important things was something she had given herself permission to do with him in a way she had never given herself permission to do before. She told him in sign in the kitchen of the ranch house on a cool October morning with the smell of coffee in the air, and he understood her immediately, and his face did something she had only seen it do a handful of times. The composure came entirely off, the steady gray eyes went very bright, and he looked at her with an openness that was total. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face and looked at her as if she were something extraordinary, which in this moment she felt entirely willing to believe she was. "Are you well?" he asked her, and the ask was real. The ask was about her, not about the child, and she loved him for that particular ordering. "I am very well," she said. He held her for a long time, and outside the plateau stretched away in all directions under a sky the particular deep blue of a Texas fall, and the cattle were somewhere beyond the creek, moving through the cedar, and the life they were building was growing a new dimension. The baby came in June of 1876, in the warmth of the early Texas summer, delivered by the town doctor, who had made the 20-mile ride from Dustcreek at Cole's summons with gratifying speed. It was a boy, born early in the morning with the first light coming through the bedroom window, and he was healthy and angry and thoroughly present in the world from the first moment, which Cole said sounded right. They named him James, for Eliza's father. He had Cole's gray eyes and Eliza's dark hair, and from the first week of his life, he watched everything with the focused attention that Cole said settled the question of who he took after. Ruth came the morning after the birth and held James Danforth with the expression of a woman whose happiness had exceeded her ability to contain it, and Eliza, tired and warm in the bed with the new morning light on her face, watched her sister and her son and her husband all in the same frame, and felt something that was larger than any word she had for it. Cole held his son with the careful gravity of a very large man handling something small and important, and he looked at James's small face with the same quality of attention he had given Eliza from the beginning, and Eliza watched him and thought, he will be the same kind of father as he is everything else. He will pay attention, he will show up, he will learn what needs to be learned. She was right. James Danforth grew up in a house where sign language was as natural as spoken language, where both were used and both were valued, where his father spoke to his mother in her own language as a matter of course, and his mother spoke in hers as a matter of right. He learned sign before he learned to speak clearly, the way children do when it is part of the house, and he used it for the rest of his life with the ease of someone for whom it was never a foreign language, but simply another part of the grammar of home. Henry Pratt died in the winter of 1877, quietly, in his sleep, at the age of 63. He had left the ranch formally to Cole in documents drawn up the previous summer, a transfer that was clean and legal and something both of them had known was coming. The ranch became the Danforth Ranch, and Cole carried the weight of it with the same steady competence Pratt had trusted from the beginning. He also carried the grief of the loss in the way he carried things he could not fix, quietly, fully, and not alone, because Eliza was there, and Eliza understood grief in the particular way of someone who has lost both parents and rebuilt, and she sat with him in it without trying to rush him through it. Mrs. Pratt moved to San Antonio to be near her daughters, but she wrote to them twice a year, Christmas and spring, for the rest of her life, and the letters always addressed Eliza warmly and specifically, and asked after James by name. Ruth married Peter Walsh in the spring of 1878. The freight operation had grown in the 3 years since he had arrived in Dustcreek, and Peter Walsh was steady and kind, and thought Ruth was the most remarkable woman he had ever met, which Eliza considered to be both true and sufficient qualification. Cole walked Ruth down the aisle in place of the father who was no longer there, which was not a role he had expected to fill and which he filled with quiet, unassuming care. And at the end of it, Ruth held his arm and looked up at him and said, "You are good for her." And Cole said, "She is good for me." And Ruth said, "I know. That is why I said it." The seamstress shop became Ruth and Peter's home base. He ran the freight, she ran the sewing, and they were, by all available evidence, genuinely happy, which Eliza observed with the deep satisfaction of someone who had wanted this for a long time and was seeing it be real. 1879 brought a second child, a daughter they named Clara, not after the schoolteacher's daughter, but after Eliza's mother, which was the origin and the meaning, and the coincidence of the shared name with Thomas Bridger's history was so thoroughly outweighed by the rightness of the naming that it was barely worth considering. Clara Danforth had her father's gray eyes and her mother's composed watchfulness, and from approximately the age of 3, a very clear sense of her own opinions that both parents found simultaneously challenging and entirely correct. Cole taught her to ride when she was 5, walking beside the small horse with his large hand on the saddle and his calm voice steady, and Eliza watched from the fence with James beside her, 8 years old, and already as tall for his age as his father had been. And she thought about the girl she had been on the boardwalk in front of the general store, watching through the glass, the stone in her chest and the composed face, and the careful management of a world that did not quite have room for her. She thought about Cole riding into that world on a roan horse and making room. She thought about the evenings by the creek and the sign language and the garnet ring and the vows in the church and the patient accumulating weight of 7 years of a man who had shown up every day in the full and specific way that showing up requires. She looked at the plateau spreading away beyond the ranch, the cedar and the live oak and the high clear sky, and the land that was hers, and she thought, the world did not make room for me. He did. And then we made room for ourselves, and for these children, and for Ruth, and for the life that grew up around all of us, and it is a good life, a large life, and it is entirely ours. James was looking at her. He had, she noticed, been watching her face in the way she watched faces, and he signed to her, the clean, easy sign of someone who had grown up in its grammar. You are happy. She looked at her son and signed back. Yes, very. He nodded with a satisfaction that was exactly his father's, and they went back to watching Clara learning to sit the small horse under Cole's steady guidance, and the evening light came down warm and golden over the Edwards Plateau, and the cattle moved through the cedar in the long shadows, and the smell of the ranch was cedar smoke and warm grass and the particular clean earth smell of Texas in the fall, and everything, completely everything, was exactly as it should be. There are things about a life that you cannot know when you are standing on a boardwalk watching through a window with a stone in your chest. You cannot know that the stone will dissolve. You cannot know that the road from that moment leads to land and children and a man who will learn your language before he asks you to share his. You cannot know that the world's failure to make room for you is not a final verdict, but a temporary condition, one that the right person, arriving at the right moment with the right quality of attention, can entirely reverse. Eliza Calloway. Danforth knew this now. She had learned it the same way she had learned everything that mattered. Slowly, carefully, through close attention and the willingness to trust the evidence when the evidence was good. She had learned it from a man with gray eyes and large calloused hands, and a notebook full of signs he had taught himself in private because he believed she was worth the learning. She had learned it from the weight of a garnet ring on her finger and the sound of her own name signed back to her in the language that was most fully hers. She had learned it from 7 years of a marriage that had not been easy in all its particulars. The frontier was never easy, the work was hard, the winters were cold, the grief was real, but had been, in every particular that mattered, entirely good. She had learned it from the look on Cole's face the first time James signed to him across the breakfast table, the gray eyes going bright and quiet in the way they still did, after all this time, when something happened that he had not known to expect and found to be better than anything he could have planned. The fiddle player Obadiah Crane was still playing at the Dustcreek social every fall, though he was slower now and occasionally forgot a tune in the middle and had to start over, and the town still gathered in the cleared grain barn with the lanterns and the long tables of food and the children running between the adult legs. Eliza and Cole still went every year, because they were part of Dustcreek now in the way you become part of a place when you have built something real in it, and because the social was where you saw people you did not see every day and reminded each other of the fact of your shared life. In the fall of 1880, they went with James and Clara, who was now 1 year old and would not sleep through the noise, and was therefore passed between adults all evening like a small, opinionated parcel, and Ruth and Peter, who were expecting their first child in the spring with a joy that was completely unconcealable. The lanterns threw gold light over everything, and Obadiah played his fiddle with the physical joy of a man who still loved the job, and people talked and ate and laughed, and the children ran, and the evening was good. Cole found Eliza standing near the barn door, looking out at the Dustcreek night, the cold stars very clear above the dark line of the plateau. He came to stand beside her, and she leaned into him slightly, and he put his arm around her in the straightforward way that came naturally to him after 6 years of marriage, easy and solid and unhurried. Clara was with Ruth, who was sitting at a table with the baby on her knee and a look on her face that suggested she was getting significant practice for the spring. Cole signed to her. His sign was fully fluent now, had been for years, natural and easy in his hands the way things become when they have been practiced long enough to stop being practice. He signed. "What are you thinking?" She looked at his hands, and then at his face, and then back out at the night. She signed back, "That I'm glad you came to Dustcreek." He looked at her for a moment, and the gray eyes were warm in the lantern light, and he signed, "So am I." Every day, she took his hand, his large, warm, calloused hand that had learned her language and held hers through 7 years of building something real. And she held it, and they stood in the barn door looking out at the Texas night together. Inside, James found them a few minutes later, 7 years old and full of the social's energy, tugging at Cole's coat. Cole looked down at his son, who signed up at him with the easy fluency of a child who had grown up with 2 languages, and told him that Obadiah was about to play a new song and that everyone needed to come back inside right now. Cole looked at Eliza. She looked at Cole. They went back inside. The fiddle started up, warm and lively, filling the barn with something bright and moving, and the lanterns threw gold light on all the faces, and James pulled his father toward the music with the determined grip of a child who knows exactly where the good things are and intends to be in the middle of them. And Clara reached for her mother from Ruth's arms, and Eliza took her daughter and held her and watched her husband being pulled through the crowd by their son, big and dark-haired and solid, laughing at something James was saying. And she thought, this is the life that opened from the worst day. This is what was on the other side of the stone and the chest and the boardwalk and the window and the careful composure that got her through. This is what it looks like when someone pays attention. She pressed her lips to Clara's dark hair, and the fiddle played on, high and clear through the warm golden light, and outside the Texas night was cold and full of stars, and everything was resolved, everything was whole, everything was held in the wide open hands of the life they had built together, and it was more than enough, it was exactly right, and it was theirs.